Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to meet you all and to start our discussions for panel 45. It's going to be a quick one or a fast one because I think we have quite what looks like very interesting papers for the usual 2 hours or so. We would, the panel, which is on peace building from below, the role of women's groups and civil society in conflict resolution, would hopefully be able to inspire us or to actually sort of promote the debate around this issue from the different papers that would be presented. I am going to introduce those that are here now, and then, well, not introduce them, but I would actually call on them to introduce themselves before we start. After the introduction, what we are going to do is that we would take 15 minutes presentations from each of the presenters. And after all the presentations have been done, we are going to have questions and probably answers or reactions, further reactions from the presenters at the end. So please do send your questions or keep them and ask at the end for those of you who might want to send the questions by writing, but do of course indicate and ask your question directly to the presenters at the end of all the presentations. The order of presentation is going to be the first. We are going to have the presentation by Yoon Young Lee, who is with Korea International Cooperation Agency, KOICA. And we are going to have the second presentation pending his joining us by Michael Ogu Ozibi from Babcock University. And we would have the third by Christiana Abonge from the University of Boya. And we would have the concluding presentation by Zainab Maibonu from Coventry University. So I think we've still not had the other two presenters joining, so we would start straight away with Zainab. Please, you would introduce yourself, and then you can just follow on after that with the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Zainab Mebono. I work at the University of Leicester, but a visiting research fellow at the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University, so working with Gordon. My presentation is about peace building from below, talking about the role of women groups. My argument is that women in Nigeria have engaged in various peace building and conflict resolution activities, yet very little is known about their roles. So I argue that in thinking about the extent to which Nigerian conflicts have been reported, studies that ignore women's participation in peace dialogue need to be addressed at certain points, because peace building necessitates visioning what constitutes peace across cultures, ethnicities, genders. Women's vocabularies and cultural repertoires of knowledge and categories of understanding are important, but in Nigeria, they tend to fade to the background during official peace negotiations. At the grassroots community levels, women community groups such as the Federation of Ogoni Women Association, Federation of Muslim Women's Association, and the Ijo Women Connect take the center stage in peace building discourses and initiatives. Yet when the dialogue starts, at the maybe at the community level, local government, state and federal, you don't really get the women being, made a part of the committees that talk about this. So going back to some of these studies that have been done, the voices of ordinary women living in their communities have been ignored, and those of relatively powerful women who hold public and political offices, are heard. For instance, studies on terrorism, and traditional political participation. So, similarly, research done on women's experiences in other conflict settings, such as Rwanda and Bosnia, Uganda, Liberia, and Angola, by people like Ali Tripp, Marie Berry, and others. They all tend to have this, top-down approach. My argument is I'm advocating for a bottom-up approach where women, because of the roles they play in these communities, should be given an opportunity to participate in peace and conflict dialogue, because they are, I always say they are the primary point of contact. They are the wives, the mothers, the sisters, they, they are always there in all of these spaces. So in doing so, my research draws insights from feminist and post-colonial studies, because the way in which women have been presented, as being socially, socially placed to take the back seat, socialized in communities, as being women are meant to be seen, not heard, is something that goes against the feminized norms of research, and also maybe going back to the post-colonial, maybe to the colonial era, where most of the dialogues were conducted with the men. So Nigeria has over the years been through so many years of cycles of conflict, with various magnitudes. So you go to the Niger Delta, we have the insurgency there. You go to the north, we have Boko Haram, indigenous settler. There are so many, one after the other. Some are ethno-religious, some are, resource related, some are political. So there are so many things going on, and in most cases, you find out that the army and the police are always brought to the fore. And work done by people like Nobia and Badmos, they do talk about, roles of the women, but some of these presentations are, very minimal where they talk about the women. Rather, my argument is that I would like to see a situation where these women, for example, the Federation of FOA, Federation of Ogoni Women's Associations, that have done a lot in the Niger Delta in bringing about peace between groups, in their community. What initiatives are there? What support services do they have, for example, from the local governments where they operate? The local government is one. What of the Nigerian, the state, at the state level, and then at the national level? Why is it that these voices are not brought on? And even some of these policies that are developed, I believe if the gendered angle is brought in, rather than looking at women only as victims, as only victims of some of these conflicts, they should be regarded, looked upon as actors in some of these situations, and they should be given an opportunity to speak, so to say, and participate in some of these policy-driven initiatives. So in terms of methodology, I use participatory methods, which is to me, I prefer a decolonial methodology, one that has been promoted as processes to generate knowledge that addresses power inequalities, one that passes power from the researcher to the research participants, more in terms looking at it as a political, not only as a political goal, but more as a goal of social justice, which is expressed through and across a wide range of psychological, social, cultural, and economic terrains. So using participatory methodologies, engaging with the women, for example, I use participatory videos, which is one that is less formal, one that, rather than just getting the women in one group, asking them to talk about peace, their understanding of peace, rather I work with them to firm up the research questions, and I asked them how they wanted to be represented, in terms of the peace building initiative. Most importantly, it is important to understand, get their own perspectives on what they constitute, what they consider as peace, what constitutes peace to them, and how they go about it. But some of my findings show that most of these women, based on the interviews and engagements we had, where they argue they are treated as second-class citizens and marginalized. Even if they want to vent, they are not allowed to. They are seen as tertiary in the society. When decisions are taken, they are of no consequence. They are not considered in the whole process. They feel they are not relevant and exploited, sidelined, especially when some of the benefits come, benefits that come after the peace has been achieved, maybe relative peace, I must say. Patriarchy is a major problem that, exists across Africa and maybe also in the Middle East and also some parts of the Western world, as we say. And then one other thing has to do with the actions and inactions of the state. So talking about the Nigerian state, here we can look at it at 3 different levels. So at the national level, the state level, and the local government level. If women's participations in peace and conflict dynamics are not really, engaged with, why should policies be, put in place that addresses women without the women's voices being carried along? The same goes for issues where maybe at the local government level, they do have maybe different committees and they always have women leaders. My findings from my research shows that even where we have women leaders, their position is not really as important as maybe the chairman or maybe the secretary in the committee. They're just there, just so that, for sure, as we say in Nigeria. Also, yes, women are targeted during crimes. And when some of these, peace discussions are going on, sometimes the timings that some of these discussions take place are done maybe out of the normal hours, maybe sometimes late in the night. So as a woman, you want to go. Sometimes if you do, you try to attend and participate. Sometimes within your own community, you're regarded, you're stigmatized as being like a loose woman, one that leaves her home and her family to go and engage with the men in dialogue. So sometimes when it comes to peace and conflict, issues, many women are forced to bottle up, their emotions, their own contributions. They are denied that social space. And sometimes, a situation where in conflict, when we talk about peace building, issues that affect women psychologically, emotionally, and even financially are not really given the attention they deserve. Rather, the emphasis is on, okay, maybe we just provide some interventions, maybe houses were burned, to try and see how maybe to place some of them in maybe camps, for example, or even provide temporary housing. What of the long-term, impacts of some of what they have gone through? I think women are best placed to talk about some of these issues. So much so that, where you find women engaging in sordid activities like drugs, cultism, and among other things, some of them tend to engage in such not because they really want to, but because they are not allowed to express their emotions, especially as it relates to peace building. There are those that do share their experiences in similar circumstances, but sometimes you're afraid to speak. And groups like the Ijaw Women Connect, led by Rosemary in the Niger Delta, they do a lot of work. And what she said to me is that, Zainab, we do this work, but we don't get that support from our local communities. We don't get support from the local government, maybe the councils there. We don't get support from the state government. So I think these are things that we should, some of us that do research on peace building, especially as it relates to gender, women, we need to bring these to the fore and say women, should be given, women that engage in peace building activities should be included in some of these dialogues, just so that we can see the possibility of getting maybe a reduction in some of these cycles of conflict in Nigeria, because there is always one conflict or another. Presently in Nigeria, in the north, we have banditry going on. We have the Fulani herdsmen. We have the indigenous settler issue. We have Boko Haram, and many others. You go to the Delta, we have, cultism activities going on. We have the insurgency, we have different militant groups whose needs are yet to be met, and you find out that there are so many women that engage in some of these. So I think a lot of work needs to be done just so that we can see how we can promote transparency and accountability in some of these dialogues, and also see to the possibility of having policies that will be impactful and make a lot of meaning to the women. I think I will stop here. I don't know if I'm still in time or if I've gone over time. You're muted, James.
Yes, sorry. I was just saying that you are just on time. We did use 5 minutes at the beginning for introductions, and so this is just net. So thank you for that presentation. I think, like I said at the beginning, there's been a hand up from Josephine. Josephine, please, we would take questions at the end of the presentations, as was said at the beginning. And if there is any question in the chat, we would also address that at the end of the 2 presentations that we have for now. I think we don't yet have Michael and Christiana, who were also supposed to present perhaps some challenges with network, has been the case recently. So we would move straight on to the second presentation. Yung, if you're ready, please.
Yes, hi, I'll just try to share my screen here. I'm not sure if you're seeing it as a slide or just as a PowerPoint. Here, I hope you're seeing it as a slide now. Yes, so hello, as I've introduced before, my name is Yunyang Lee, and I'll be presenting my paper on the issue of norm diffusion on conflict-related sexual violence, and especially focusing on the issue of comfort women in South Korea. And I've recently finished my MA in Gender and Development at IDS in University of Sussex, and this was actually my dissertation. So this study primarily focuses on the issue of comfort women and those exploited by the Japanese Imperial Army during the Asia-Pacific War. And this paper traces the norm life cycle with respect to CRSV and how comfort women themselves contributed to the discourse on CRSV as norm entrepreneurs in the international arena. And I try to analyze how this process at the global level affected the norm diffusion in the domestic arena in South Korea, and even impacted the portrayals of the survivors in South Korea. So linking the literatures on norm life cycle, agency, and recognition, I argue that active participation of comfort women in global norm change process led to recognition of survivors' agency, which then expanded the possibilities and opportunities for their activism. So to explain a little bit further on the history of comfort women, I'm hoping you're seeing the slide now. So history of comfort women starts during the Asia-Pacific War, which happened during 1931 to 1945. And they were the victims of military sexual slavery recruited by Japanese army. and many girls and women were trafficked or even coerced to become comfort women, and majority of them came from South Korea, which was under Japanese colonization during that time. So the term comfort woman is a direct translation of Japanese word uyanfu, which was used during the war. And although it's a very androcentric word that does not highlight its exploitative nature, the activist still uses the term together with the quotation mark to remember the state-driven and systemic nature of its violence. And even after the war, only a few returned home, and still most of the survivors lived under trauma, hiding their experiences due to social stigma and shame. And the issue of comfort women remained in silence for almost half a century until survivor Kim Ak-sun became the first survivor to give an official statement on her experiences, and that happened only in 1991. But she was not the last one, and after that, they were able to find more survivors, and it grew up to the number of 238 survivors. And because sexual violence was still a very big taboo in Korean society, it was a shock to the country when women in their 60s and 70s spoke about their sexual violence, experience with sexual violence. And after Kim Ok-sun's public statement, the Korean feminist activists gathered, and the Korean Council for Women drafted for military sexual slavery was established, and they became the key actors fighting for redress and reparation. And throughout 3 decades of activism, which is still very ongoing actively, comfort women have gained support from international frameworks and documents and other state actors. But however, Japanese government is still reluctant to officially recognize and apologize for such violation of human rights. And they're still continuing their weekly Wednesday protest that happens every week in front of Japanese embassy in Seoul. And it will soon mark its 1,500th protest on next month. So in my paper, I try to look at how global norm diffusion on CRSV happened, and especially related with comfort women, and how these comfort women actors also participated actively in this process. And some of I think I'll be mindful of time. And by looking at that, I look at the process of global norm diffusion and also how such diffusion made domestic norm internalization process possible and impacted the recognition and portrayals of survivors. So some of the key framework that I use is the norm life cycle from Finmore and Sicking from 1998. And this is a framework that points out that how norms are emerged through contestations in the international arena, and it cascades rapidly once it passes the tipping point, and with the significant mass of state actors adopt the norm. And this cycle argues that once the norm is widely spread enough, domestic laws and bureaucracy conforms with it, and the norm becomes powerful as it becomes internalized and taken for granted. So to apply the complex nature of global norm diffusion, I adopted this framework and with accompanying some of the critics, and I fit the case of norm diffusion on CRSV as shown on the slide right now. And I emphasize the contested nature of the norms and the legitimacy and recognition provided by the norm change, and how the local norm entrepreneurs contribute to framing new norms and by leveraging the recognition in the domestic arena. So other key concepts I use to analyze the situation on agency, victimhood, and recognition. So in this paper, I argued, well, navigating political dynamics of norm contestations and diffusion, norm entrepreneurs or activists and survivors gain empowerment and recognition of their agency. So Kabir defines agency as the ability to define one's goal and act upon them, which is a very wide range of definition, and it also encompasses the motivation and sense of agency. But in a lot of the literatures, especially some literature on domestic violence, it also points out there is a dichotomy of victimization and agency that exists for survivors, and sometimes their images are very simplified, and they're always shows either as victims or agents. And however, but I argue that survivors can also mobilize and perform agencies in various complicated ways, even in conjunction with victimization. And based on this, so forms of survivors' agency can be very diverse, and that's why I try to recognize the expansion of agency of survivors as my analytical concept rather than the agency itself. So my paper focuses on secondary research and to analyze the norm diffusion process, and I mostly collected the data and analyzed key events and documents on CRSV and comfort movement based on the core structure of the norm life cycle. And I try to see how domestical portrayal of these survivors changed based on academic literatures and survivors' positionality and politics of representation. So the history of global norm diffusion on CRSV is a very prolonged process, as you would already know. And some of the earliest efforts started from 1800s, but it took a while, and the women's rights discourse rose through UN Decade of Women in 70s through 80s, and it was in 1990s when the mass rape on the conflict in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Rwanda gained global attention as a serious human rights violation. So this is when the global norm emerged and went on to the tipping point, which in one of the most significant point of this tipping point is in 2000 when UN Security Council resolution formed 1325, which is a Security resolution on women's peace and security. And since together with this process, since the 1990s, oh, I'm realizing I'm very short on time. Okay, I'll try to make it in time. So this is some of the key events and documents that comfort women try to participate in the process, although texts are very tiny. So there is a testimony that started all this movement in 1991, and they were always consulted, and they try to include their testimony as much as possible in all of the international human rights declaration, for example, Vienna Declaration on Human Rights. And they were there in Beijing when Beijing Declaration for and Plan for Action was happening, and they visit UN Security Council and the Human Rights Council every year, and they have been advocating and sharing their experiences and testimonies ever since for almost 30 years. And most of their strategies, some of their strategies include establishing norms in United Nations, as mentioned. They visited all UN agencies, and they were strong norm entrepreneurs and participated in shaping this global norm. And they also established a transnational advocacy network for Women's International War Crimes Tribunal in 2000s. And they also engaged actively with other survivors in Asia. And they also engaged foreign state actors, for example, in US and Canada, and they provided their testimonies in their parliament. So by engaging in this global norm process, domestic norms also slowly changed, and internalization happened in Korea. So when the issue was first brought up, the issue of comfort women was understood from very nationalistic point of view and androcentric point of view. And before it was brought up in 1990s, it was under the silence of almost for 50 years. And Korea's social political development context did not leave any room for voices of marginalized to be heard. And in 1990s, when the issue first started to gain attention, the narrative was produced by the public and media, and it was often reinforcing victimhood to survivors, and it mostly focused on how innocent girls they were when they were first trafficked, and how these innocent girls were brutally violated. And countless interviews and testimonies were done with survivors, only focusing and only questioning their traumatic versions of the past. And this process was reinforcing the victimhood and only finding the value of survivors' identity from very restricted forms of victimhood. And such process produced a narrative of comfort women as very homogeneous victimized group. But in recent days, in 2000 and 2010s, the portrayals of survivors are slowly changing and is transforming as an image of human rights activists. And before, they were only portrayed as poor girls or poor grandmas. And these recently, some of the cases have shown that these survivors who are still alive are being considered as human rights activists, as Korea's national discourse is also slowly following with the global norm change. And they're finally realizing this issue more from the human rights violation and more on the side of CRSV rather than attack on Korean nationalistic agenda or attack on Korean innocent girls. And these survivors have been engaging with a lot of activism since the beginning. And recently, these individual survivors were being awarded and recognized for their efforts. And this trend especially escalated, especially around 2017, when AFP News awarded Kim Bok-dong, one of the survivors, as one of the significant activists fighting for freedom around the world. And then they also received, a lot of the individuals also started receiving awards as human rights activists. And this change does not mean that survivors existed in the dichotomized realm of either victims or agents, but I think it shows that together with this global norm diffusion, they were allowed more space and their agency was able to expand. So earlier, they were only able to produce very homogeneous and very set point of testimony, which only focused on their traumatic experiences and their victimhood. But after, when together with the global norm change, when Korea's society was finally able to recognize this as more of human rights issue, and also the issue of women's rights and so on. They were able to choose the identity of human rights activists. And since then, they also been actively engaging with other survivors of CRSP, for example, in Uganda or Rwanda. And some of the survivors would set up funds to support the survivors abroad. And so throughout the norm diffusion process in global and domestic arenas, I argue that survivors were able to expand their form of activism. And because survivors have advocated for their experiences and they spoke up in this international arena, and as I told, these few survivors also established some fund and they're proactively raising their voice as activists. And so I argue that norm emergence offers a space for collectives and for activists to participate, engage in this discourse as norm entrepreneurs. So because global norm emergence happened, comfort women survivors were given space to actually engage and participate in global arena. And it provided these survivors with more legitimacy, and it helped them to push for change, especially in South Korea. And I think it had happened both simultaneously. They raised their voice very actively in global arena, and they brought up the results that happened in global and brought it back to Korea. And they say, here it is. Everyone is agreeing that we are, it has been a human rights violation, and it has been providing stronger identity for them as activists. And when such diffuse norm is widely accepted internationally, I argue that norm can also become the new binding identity for these actors. And so, for example, CRSP has formed a giant group of survivors of CRSP, and now they can actively engage in transnational networks and alliances, as the survivors had already been doing. So, although an acceptable resolution for survivors is still yet to come from the Japanese government, I think it's very important to see what they have accomplished so far from past decades. And it's very sad to recognize there are only a handful of survivors left alive today. And I think that I thought it was a timely contribution to commemorate these struggles and achievement, and to see what actually the survivors have contributed the global norm change, and how it had also acted as expanding their agency for survivors in Korea also. And I think I have went way over time, I'm sorry. And I think I'll conclude here. And if you have any questions, I think we can continue later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hyung Yong. It's been quite rich. We still do not have, I think, the other two presenters showing up. So I think at this point, make a few of my own comments about the presentations, and then we would open the floor for questions to the presenters. So first, I'd like to thank both presenters for the very rich presentations. They really help us to understand what place or what contribution women can actually make to peace, whether it's in the case in a situation like that in Nigeria where there is a need to actually end violence, or whether it's in a situation where there is a need for a sort of if I get it right, a sort of transformation of conflict, which is a situation which, if I get it well, is the situation with the women in South Korea, because there is here a need, in my view, for a transformation of a situation that prevails after the war. So the interesting thing about the two presentations is that they are complementary. The first one mostly presented to us one thing: the efforts that women are making, the efforts of women in Nigeria to actually promote peace. But there was some presentation of the challenges that they actually face, and we actually get to see that while there is a lot of effort being made by women's groups in Nigeria, their contribution to peace is not really felt. It's not very visible because they don't really get to be given the space to actually take part in very formal processes. And also they do not, they seldom receive support from the local government, and they don't occupy frontline roles when they are included in peace discussions or negotiations in Nigeria. So these are the key things that I pulled out of the first presentation. The second one now sort of when I say it's complementary, is because the second one sort of gives us a lot of hope, which is, even though women face these challenges, there are strategies that can enable them to actually overcome them. And this, in the case of the comfort women in South Korea, the presentation shows that one of the things that they can do, one such strategy is that of projection from outside of the local space. And so in this case, we see that the women projected themselves into international spaces, the United Nations, other states, and that it created a sort of a space within which there could be a diffusion of norms, and that these at the same time led to a change in the discourse at the local level. It's the two present with a lot of optimism about the contribution that women can actually make to peace efforts around the world. Now, with regards to the first question, the first presentation, I do have some areas where I think there is need to actually shed more light. The first one is that it might be necessary, and if you can do that, Zainab, appreciate for us to shed a little bit more light on what it is specifically that women do differently that should be promoted or that we can build on. So because when we look at the strategies that Young actually presents for in her paper, these are strategies that, yes, men can also use, I think, when trying to approach a problem like this. But are there some particular strategies, or is there a particular way of actually promoting peace, which is peculiar to women? It might be necessary to flag this out if there is. Now, the other thing is, do we have a success story? Because Nigeria is big, and I understand there's a lot going on in Nigeria. So do we have a success story of maybe a community where women have, in spite of the odds, actually led the peace efforts and succeeded in Nigeria? That might actually be a good source for more discussion. So the last question is also whether the groups in your study are formal or informal groups. So I think I shouldn't miss this one out. You focus a lot. You focus on women groups that are contributing to peace. Do we have other women's groups that are undermining peace in Nigeria? So, because in the north, the situation particularly has persisted, and given the strategic place of women in the society there, we might be asking ourselves if it could go on for so long without maybe women sympathizing or in one way or the other. So it would be interesting to know if some of these groups have actually been supporting the conflict actors. So and then for Young, I already said that you actually paint a very good picture of this, particularly of the strategies that were employed. And I should say that your paper is very important because beyond looking at the question of gender-based violence in situations of war, the comfort women have often been perceived as women who consented to what happened, and so they are usually left aside when actually the problem of gender-based violence is discussed. And so people fail to realize, perhaps as you demonstrate, that even those who we assume consented did not consent, and this is actually why these women, I think, are protesting today. And if the problem of comfort women is taken seriously, it definitely sheds more light on the urgency that there is to end all forms of gender-based violence in situations of conflict. And my question to you is, okay, I really didn't have a question here. That it's not a question. The question rather comes from Davini, which says, I actually did my 11 years. The opinion, sorry, I just want to go straight to the question. I was wondering, what was your, okay, I think I should read the whole sentence. The opinion that I had created for myself regarding why Japan would not concede on a formal apology for these women was a mix of racism, pride, and basically wait for them to not be a problem anymore. They are very old, and Japan, I was wondering what was your opinion on this? Why Japan will not make a formal apology? Also, despite the activism, this was not sufficient. What do you think could be done differently for their condition to be acknowledged and their situation change? Okay, yes. So that's the question. Other questions, please. The floor is open. We have quite a lot of time for questions and answers because we haven't had two other participants. So again, like I said, this is a very rich topic and very good presentations, which give room for very rich discussions, I assume. We have in the chat box.
Take these questions first. Can we respond to the first set of questions? And then,
okay. Yes, actually, there's first one question for Yung Yo. And so I was trying to have, in addition to my questions, at least a few from the audience before we respond. So I think, okay, I'm not seeing, please do ask questions directly to the participants and not necessarily in the chat box. So we have just one question so far from the chat box and those that I have asked. So Zainab, maybe you go first.
Yeah. So in terms of ways of promoting peace that are peculiar to women, these groups that I work with, for example, there's this dialogue, that goes on, engagement between a mother and her son, or a wife and her husband, or you to your brother, a woman to her brother, or uncle, So sometimes these women, the way they address, they go about engaging in peace dialogue is that they reach out, individually, to maybe if between two communities. So a group from community A will now send a message of invitation, to dialogue to women in, some of the women in group B, in community B. And in the process, what they do is that a lot of apologies are exchanged initially. We're here to make peace. We're not here to fight. we are brothers, we are sisters. So most of these women, what they do is that they sort of preach to their children, they preach the concept of peace. For example, Federation of FOA, Federation of Ogoni Women, they do a lot of work in terms of non-violence, building on what they learned from Ken Saro-Wiwa, their late leader, He preached a lot of non-violence, and he said, you fight not with guns and knives, but with your pen, and you talk, you speak, you dialogue. So for FOA, what they do is they reach out to different communities, in their area, and they talk about, they preach peace. When they find out that some of the young men are agitating, or maybe something is going to go wrong, or maybe clashes, they reach out to the elderly women in some of these groups. And when they do, they try talking to their children, to their husbands, to their uncles, to their brothers. So this is something that, because the cycles, are just going, there's always one thing or another, sometimes 3 or 4 taking place at different places in Nigeria. Some of these initiatives, by the women in terms of the dialogue, not the normal dialogue, that you come and sit on the table, formal, but they have the personal touch that they add to it, I think should be considered when major issues happen. Some of the local women groups should be included in the dialogue and maybe given an opportunity to engage, to try and bring some of the different, warring groups, sometimes the leaders together, because sometimes if the women have that understanding, then it is helpful when it comes to preaching peace. So in terms of success stories, yes, I know Ijaw Women Connect in the Ijaw communities in the Niger Delta, particularly in Bayelsa State. They've done a lot. They brought about peace when, in terms of some of the communities where you find the young men engaging in, pipeline vandalization, and some of them engage in artisanal mining that would, at the same time, impact negatively, destroy the environment. There's always one form of spillage or another because, of the crude way in terms of how they're doing. Sometimes they reach out to some of these youth groups, because some of them are like family to them. The way we operate in Africa is that your family members are not only your siblings, we have extended family. Sometimes even your neighbors are regarded as family because we've been together for a very long time. So, they do a lot, and they engage in one community that I know, and I don't want to mention the name, where they brought together the youth, different 2 sets of youth, members, and they had dialogue, and the violence stopped, because at one time they were fighting over a particular abandoned oil well. So that intervention was really very good, because they were able to bring them together and, pacify all of them. And so far, they're all calm now. And there's a lot, even among, maybe in Otuasega, one of the communities that I visited, a lot of initiatives in terms of where the women that will engage some of these cults, so-called youth cult members, you preach to them and try to bring them together and pacify them and explain to them, preach them the importance of peace, and if you want peace, you should also try, and get more education rather than engage in some of these activities. Try and go back to school, maybe finish your secondary school, and if you can, maybe you learn one trade or another, or if your parents can afford it, or you get some form of scholarship, you go to the university. So in terms of whether there are women groups that are undermining, yes, there are, because the local women sometimes don't see women engagement in some of these dialogues as being productive, because there is that belief, the traditional belief that the woman should always take the back seat. You should be seen, not heard. So sometimes women activists in some of these areas find it very difficult because of the stigma associated. If you're too vocal, and try to engage, sometimes even women, local women, that are supposed to support you, will look at you like, as like you're being too loose. And the fact that you're being very vocal and moving from one place to another amounts to maybe you sleeping around with X, Y, and Z. So this is the problem. I think sometimes there's the need to even sensitize. Some of these women, local women, don't even know they have rights. They don't. You know, it is one thing for you to know and understand that you have rights, and also to know that you can play a key role in bringing about peace, you know, in your own community and maybe between your community and another one. I think this is important, but I think it's some form of maybe sensitization, awareness, you know, campaigns that needs to go on in some of the areas. I know I spoke to the POA women group and also the Ijo Women Connect, for example. And when you come to the north, you know, because of religious issues also, sometimes women are reluctant, and they are maybe because of the tradition and culture, they are sometimes these form one barrier or another because you're not allowed to, you know, sometimes. But for those that are really active, they are doing a lot, and I think they deserve to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. We can Yung, there was well, it looks like a series of questions actually. So, and I've seen that you've seen them. So, over to you.
Yes. First of all, thank you for amazing question. It is a very interesting question that you raised. So you asked why Japan would still not concede on formal apology, and why are they still refusing to do this, and you wanted my opinions on this. And I definitely agree. You did say it, you think it's a mix of racism, pride, and basically they're just waiting for all the survivors to die because they're gonna be gone very soon, and which is very true, because I think we only have about 14 survivors left. Most of them are in 80s or even in their 90s, because this happened during 1930s and 1940s, and they were teenagers or 20s back then. So a lot of survivors already died off, and there only few of them are surviving. And I think it is true. I think it's because of this diplomatic tension, very masculine diplomatic tension between Korean government and Japanese government, and it is their fight between their pride and ego, and women's rights are just being sidelined in between this ego fight between very masculine governments. Because in Korea and Japan, they both have very low representation of women in their parliaments and in their politics. So it is a very masculine and very old representation, because a lot of the politicians in Korea are men in their 50s and 70s. Our president is in his 70s. So these men does not have feminist agenda in their minds. They don't have understanding on women's experiences, and they think of conflicts or conflict resolution or peace or diplomacy is in their own masculine word. They don't think woman comes in part of it. So in one of the earliest agreement between Korea and Japan, there was an agreement in 1965 after the liberation, after the war, Asia Pacific War ended. There was an agreement to settle how the colonial legacies and everything. But when that agreement was set, of course, none of the voices of women or none of the voices of minority people were included. It was just a very strict agreement between these very male governments, and they just talked about their finances and budgets and everything. So and now we know that it's a problem now, because after around 2000, because of all this global discussion, we now know women and peace and security agenda is very important. It's very important to include women's voices into peace process. And I think this is one of the reasons, because these women's voices were not included in the first place. Now we're having the after effects of these survivors still fighting for reparation in their 80s and 90s. And this happened over almost like 80, 70 years ago, and they're still fighting for it. So this is a very bad example of what happens when women's voices are not heard between the peace process. And you were also asking, so despite their activism, obviously this was not sufficient because they still haven't gotten what they wanted. And if I could think of any better strategies or something that we could have done different. And I think this is a very difficult question, because I do think the survivors and activists have done what they can do best, because they are really trying their best, and the civil society and people have been supporting them for a lot. But it might be a question of that should be addressed to Japanese and Korean government. I think government has to do better. It's not, I think the responsibility has to lie a bit more on the governments, because Korean government is also a bit reluctant, or always a bit passive of pursuing this agenda, because they always think it's a very sensitive diplomatic issue, and they don't think of it as human rights violation issue. So maybe that was one of the difficult dilemmas. So a lot of the politics or politicians think of this comfort women issue as diplomatic issue over colonization period and stuff. But there is also, in gender perspective and in global perspective, they see this issue as human rights violation and women's rights violation. But because a lot of the Korean politics still think of it under their nationalistic agenda, and still think of it as more of a reparation during colonial era and reparation of this period that we suffered Japanese colonial era, I think there is this dilemma, like whether to pursue it as this under this nationalistic agenda and have some more support from nationalistic civil society, or to pursue it in women and gender peace agenda, but there might be less support from civil society, because of course there are more people who are interested in this nationalistic agenda, and there are more people who get more angry when they think of it in a sense, they raped our girls, they raped our grandmas, rather than just protecting women's dignity and general women's rights violation. So it's a very difficult question, and I still don't know, but I think they have done a lot, and they did achieve a lot compared to what could have not happened, especially to start participating in activism in very late in their life, especially in 60s and 70s, and like they started in their 60s and 70s, and they've been traveling globally ever since. And some of these women, most of them are underprivileged, impoverished, and they're less educated, but they've been trying really hard to learn English to give testimonies in international arena. So I think they have been trying their best, and maybe it should be more responsibility, and it should be more question that Korean government has to think about, like how to be more a feminist government, how to include more of women's voices in this peace process, and maybe we need to approach it a little bit more on that. So I hope this answered some of your questions. Yep.
Thank you. Yes, Zainab, I think you have a question there from, is it from Morrison? Yes.
Okay, can I quickly respond to you? Yeah.
Sorry. Okay.
Can I quickly, because it's like the two of us are singing the same song, you know, and I really like, yeah. It's just like a comment. Honestly, I like your work, and it's really interesting, and I look forward maybe in future an opportunity to read, you know, what you've done, and see how maybe the possibility of applying your own framework to my own situation, and maybe you could consider my own framework to yours. Thank you. Yeah. So question.
Yes. So there's a question to you, Zainab, from Morrison, who says, what sort of interventions are suggested to involve women's lived experiences in their work for peace building or conflict resolution. So what kinds of interventions are suggested to involve women's lived experiences in conflict resolution work, I think, if I get it well. Now, and maybe just to add to that, another question from me is, you mentioned that women are having difficulties accessing local government support. So what kind of support do you think a local government can provide which would enhance the contribution or which would effectively promote the contribution of women? And to you, Yung Yong, now, how were these comfort women recruited? I think it's important for us to understand how they become comfort women. If you can say something about that, thank you.
So, the first question: what types of what sort of interventions, for example? Diane's question, I think that's the first one, if I'm not mistaken. So, there is this concept of vernacular security. And the argument posed by scholars here is that everyone's voice, especially the marginalized, needs to be heard, especially as it relates to security threats in everywhere, okay? So for me, for the women in Nigeria, for example, there's a lot going on. No peace. There's one thing leads to another. One thing leads to another. Since these women have have their own strategy of working at the grassroots level, so this is a bottom-up approach. Why don't you empower them? Give them the opportunity to be members of some of these peace-building initiatives, so that you could give them the free hand of engaging, dialoguing, with the different groups. For example, if it's the youth, the young men that are making trouble, why don't you give them an opportunity to engage with them, try and bring them together? And the important thing is that you recognize their work and apply their own suggestions when policies are being made. I remember Yoon also spoke about, policies that the policies are just being put in place without, without really being sensitive to some of these, the women that have been victims, for example. So I believe women, some of them have lived through some of these issues. Some of them in Nigeria, it's maybe where they've been attacked, women have been raped, molested, they've had their farmlands or houses taken away or houses burnt, or even forced to engage in one act or another. Since they have that lived experience, why don't you learn from them, listen to them and give them the opportunity so that when they're engaging with maybe another party, it doesn't really stop at maybe listing, have typing, this is what we have, listed, this one has gone through this. Sometimes, there are communications between women, that you don't really have to talk, but we understand each other. For example, a woman, we have our ways when we look at each other in terms of pleading, trying to maybe calm you down. We look at each other, we have certain gestures that we do understand. So why don't you give these women the opportunity, and which goes to what, the vernacular security theory is saying. Give them the opportunity, let them be the ones that should, talk about some of the solutions and avenues in terms of how to go about building peace. As it is in Nigeria, there is no peace. Things are getting worse by the day. People are fleeing, men, women. You go to the farm, you're a farmer, you're either kidnapped or killed. So what is going on? So these are the issues. And I think women, I've been a woman, we have our own strategies. So those that are active at the grassroots level on ground, why don't, at the local level, the state level, and the federal level, it starts at the local government level. if they are carried along by the local government, some of these, information could be shared with the state at the state government level, and they could be invited and to engage and to go higher. Then in terms of what types of interventions they need, they only need, you need to give them, facilitate their work. For example, moving from one place to another would require, sometimes you would require a car, and that car would need fuel, for example. The driver would need a driver, where if a woman can drive, fine. But because of the insecurity going on in Nigeria, if they're moving, give them the, security, the support that they deserve. There are places where in the Niger Delta that they don't even have roads, so you move from one community to another, you use the canoe, or boat. So why don't you provide that to them? If they need, finances to maybe bring, because when you bring together people, you feed people, you provide at least some form of refreshments or entertainment, as we say in Nigeria, item A or B, So you should do that. Give them, give them these resources so that empower them, so that they will be able to move from one place to another. And where they need security, provide for them, rather than, yes, okay, go. Sometimes they pull resources from their own, hard, and some of them, I engage with them. Some of them, they sell food or stuff in the market, but they are still able to contribute to, for example, the Ijaw Women Connect, just so that, help can be given to, peace can be preached, to some of these women. I think a lot needs to be done, but they need to be empowered. It doesn't stop at, I know one of Rosemary, the leader, the president of Ijaw Women Connect. Sorry, I've been talking about this organization because they've been doing a lot. She has so many, prizes, one recognition or another. But she said to me, Zainab, it stops at this. No one has even given me 10,000 naira or even 1,000 naira to buy fuel. No one, not even the local government chairman, will ask Rosemary, do you need a car? I can give you a bus that will convey you, to help us go to this community and talk to them, or address some of the issues. So these are all the things. They only need to be empowered, and it doesn't take much to do that. Thank you.
Yes, Yung Yong.
Yes. So you asked how some of these comfort women were recruited in the process. So as according to many of the testimonies, they were usually coerced or tricked into believing they're going behind the front line just to provide some labor, or that they will be paid some good money in foreign money, because they needed a lot of labor during the war. So a lot of the girls were recruited saying they're just supporting the behind lines and stuff. And there are some testimonies saying that some of them were trafficked, they were kidnapped during the night, and a lot of the girls who were brought in during this time were mostly from already impoverished family and stuff, because there is also testimony and experiences saying some of the wealthy families or some of the elite families during that time already knew, and already they wanted to protect their daughters. They didn't send their daughters to the front line. So some of the girls who had to go to earn money were very poor people and coming from these poor families, which also generated additional intersectionality with all this class difference and their wealth difference. And a lot of the people, elite families or wealthy families, would have married their girls off earlier to prevent them from being kidnapped or being trafficked. And they would send them to girls' university to protect them. So later on, some of these elite girls who survived those era also becomes one of those, became leading activists who established these supporting NGOs that, especially, for example, the Korean Council, one of the biggest actors that supported the comfort women, was also led by women in similar age of these survivors. And the representative also shared her experience, saying she could have actually been drafted as a comfort woman, but she was able to avoid it because her family knew how to do it, and she was able to go into university, and she avoided her experience. But she later on realized how other girls in her similar age from poor families couldn't avoid such to be drafted or to be coerced, and that's why she thought it's her responsibility to support these women from that are similar to her age but had completely different experiences. And that's why these women, even after when they came back, they had much lesser ground. They maybe already lost all of their family members, and they were already impoverished, and with the stigma and everything, they had to live a very harsh life, and they couldn't establish nice family bond with their partners due to their experience with violences. So I think it's a lot of context in there, and yeah. Yeah, so yeah.
Thank you. I'm really happy that you have given us, you had those answers, and because they actually help us to understand better why it is that something needs to be done, at the very least to acknowledge what those women went through. I think, Zainab, we have Michael Ogu, who has come in now, and we don't have much time. Maybe that's what you wanted to say. So we are going to take your presentation, Michael, and then we would have the last thoughts from all the three presenters at the very end. So, Michael, you would please introduce yourself, and then you have 15 minutes to do your presentation. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. Hello, good evening, James and everyone else. I think my presentation was scheduled for tomorrow. On the calendar, I see it's appearing on Tuesday, 10 a.m. And so that's what I just joined in because it's the first part of the panel. So I just joined in to participate in the program in the presentations for today. I see 10 a.m. to 11:45 a.m. tomorrow.
Okay. Well, then I think we had a bit of a mix-up, Michael. We thought that you had agreed to swap your slot today. I mean tomorrow with the other friend who couldn't cast, who couldn't make it today. No. So that's why we have been under the impression you were presenting today. So, but we would then see how to handle all tomorrow. That's all right. If you're not ready to present, then that's fine. We would, yes.
Presentation. That's why I can't do it alone. I have two other co-authors, so yeah. I can't. Yeah, they are not here, so I can't go ahead and do that alone.
Okay, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. So we look forward to your presentation tomorrow. And we were actually now receiving questions from the participants. So if you have any question for the two presenters, please do ask. It's been quite a good panel. I think that the discourse on the grassroots peace building, which needs to take the role of women particularly seriously, is really enriched by the discussions that we've been having since the beginning. Now, I think while have I missed any question on the chat? No. Okay. Yeah, mostly comments. Yeah. So we actually see that women we all probably would agree that women do need to be on the table. I think one big challenge, however, and Zainab, you talk about women's groups. So one challenge, however, is that with bottom-up approaches is that some people who are from the liberal perspective or school and want to dismiss any effort at bringing this in, would say is, how do you get so many people to a discussion room? How do you meet all of them? And if we're talking about providing resources, how do we provide resources to a whole community? So you talk about women's groups. So is it every, I mean, it's obvious perhaps what we have to do, but I'm raising this because it turns out it's not that obvious. So how do we actually make sure that women and women's groups, or women through women's groups, participate? How many is enough? So how exact, what would you, what did you find in your study? What would work if the governor had to provide support? Who is he providing support to? How does he know this person truly, represents, if you like? Or is he going directly to the community to listen and to talk to just every woman or every group in that community? It would be interesting if you could shed light on that.
So the question of how many is enough, as many as we can get. That is the answer to that, especially when it comes to women issues. But really, in some of the communities that I visited, some have no women, no organization, no women group, some don't, but there are those that I visited and I engaged with their leaders that already they have something going on. So it's not something that would just come out of the blue. I wouldn't expect maybe a governor or a chairman to just announce that, who are the women groups in this community or in this state, I want to help them. No, you go down to the level, to the grassroots level, to these communities, you engage. And in the process, it is easy for you to know those, women that are engaged into one peace building activity or another, because the local woman there, even if you go to the market, you start talking, because they're visible, they're known, sometimes even like I mentioned, because of the stigma, negative stigma attached to them. So it is very easy. But these are the groups that need support. So we're not talking about start something, out of the blue and, just get maybe people, a group of people that would try to embezzle funds and say, we're into this, we're into that. So it is easy. These women have been engaged in these activities, peace building activities. They have their own networks, they have various meetings at different levels. Why don't you empower them? Reach out and engage with them. I think it is very easy, rather than say, no, we'll go to this community and we'll go to maybe the leaders of the community, predominantly men, with all due respect, James. So predominantly men, and then we'll say they are the gatekeepers. No, why go through such bureaucracy? Go directly to those that are engaged in this, and even some of the youth groups, they will talk to you, they will tell you about some of the, women, women leaders that they have been working with. So they are visible, most of them. So it's not something that is like rocket science. It's just basic facts. You go down to the level and engage at that level.
Now, I have to get back to you on this because having an idea of the cultural context in northern Nigeria, for instance, I doubt if it's possible for, let's say, a male governor to just go down to meet women without facing some hostility. Is it possible to really, if the person who was leading a peace effort or who needed to convene talks was a man, would it be possible for them to really go into the community and just meet women? And secondly, if you have discussions convened, would it be okay with communities in North and Northeast Nigeria to for women to sit alongside men on around tables?
Yeah, in terms of, I spoke initially about religious and cultural differences between the northern Nigeria and the other part. But for example, in northern Nigeria, we have Jam'iyyar Mata Arewa, that is one. We have Federation of Muslim Women Association. We have Matan Zumunta, the Christian women groups, and these are local groups that are active, and some of them do engage. They have meetings, so the identified women leaders, are those that are able to engage, to have a dialogue with the state government when the needs arises. I'm not saying like everyone, no, we have, religious, the Sharia principles according to Islam in Nigeria, that is going on in Nigeria, but they have recognized leaders. Why not engage with them? So a lot of progress. There's a lot of progress. So many changes. Institutional changes, even in northern Nigeria, because we have women politicians. We have women that are aspiring to become governors. So both Christian and Muslim. And since we have some of these changes, why not engage with them in dialogue? Gone are the days where they will say, maybe in northwestern Nigeria, the women will not speak, they don't, they are not able to. They can, and they have voices, they have recognized leaders at the local level. If you go to the churches, they have Matan Zumunta, for example, in southern Kaduna, for example. And these are women, that do a lot in terms of peace building, bringing about peaceful, harmonious relationships. Why are they not given why are their voices not heard? Why don't they include them when policy dialogues are going on? There's a lot going on, and the changes are there. So I think, yes, there are religious and cultural issues, but there are so many changes. You are muted, James.
Thank you very much. I like that you talk about you allude to the idea of credibility, because being in an African context, I know that from my very limited knowledge of South Korea, Young, you would correct me, but I think you said something which draws to those similarities. The situation in many parts of Africa in terms of gender is quite similar to that in South Korea. And so it's good to know that in spite of the odds, it's possible to actually have women on the table. And of course, you've addressed the question of how to get credible actors, because another problem sometimes we see is that we actually get people who go to the table and who do not actually bring much, because they were more interested in the incentives of participating, or they were created as a result of these very incentives. So the last thing I would like to question, I would like to ask, I'm not seeing, okay, I think I'm not seeing any new question in the chat box and no hand up. So my last question will go to you, Young. The gender, I'm a bit surprised that gender is still from what you said is an issue with the Korean government. Do you not have women represented in the Korean, sufficiently represented in the Korean government? And have these women not tried to take up the problem of comfort women?
Yes. So currently, Korea has very, very low representation of women in our parliament. And in our recent parliament, we only have about 19%, which is very low and surprising, especially in one of the countries, because we are one of the OECD countries. So we're always ranked the lowest in regard to gender equality and stuff in OECD countries. We have very low representation in politics or even in the area of economic participation. So we do have some women quota system, but I think it's barely functioning. So it's not really effective yet, but the rate has been slowly rising. One interesting thing is in our current, with our current parliament, there is one female congresswoman who actually worked with the Korean Council, who actually worked with the Comfort Women movement. And because she was one of the few civil society activists who was able to have some influence, because the Comfort Women movement is one of the biggest or one of the most famous civil society movement in Korea. So I think that's why she was able to get more recognition and popularity. So she became, previously she was a representative of the Korean Council, working on the Comfort Women issues, and now she's currently a congresswoman. So we are now seeing some women who have who are coming from this gender or feminist activism and now getting into politics. And we do see that hopefully it will rise, the ratio will rise and it will get better, but still among hundreds and hundreds of other men, they're just still very few. It's only one woman who comes from this feminist activism background and one woman coming from Comfort Women. And although she tries, there's still hundreds and 80% more of old men who would still care more about economy and other issues, and who would say, oh, we need to move forward. That's the story from the past. And it does, so it is still difficult, but I do hope the representation would get better by next term, hopefully. So we do still have some struggles. We do have some wins, but still have much more struggles left. So.
Thank you. But I think Zainab alluded to the domination, the predominance of men in leadership when it comes to peace processes, but also the decisions are taken by men. In the case of South Korea, we do know that unlike South Korea is one of the few countries in the world that has actually had a woman as a prime minister. Did it make any difference when she was there, Prime Minister? What's the name again?
President Park Geun-hye. So the thing is, she was a daughter of the strong dictator that was in Korea during the 1980s. So she gained a very popular vote from conservative just because she was a daughter of the famous general dictator. And there was a lot of critiques on her, especially from civil society and feminist side, saying she does not represent women's experiences, because she has been brought up almost as a princess during her father's dictatorship, and she has been raised to get everything she wants, and she did not feel any she did not experience any minority issue as of being women, because she was already privileged, and she had a strong political support network behind her. So when we did have some hopes about her, but it turns out she did not have much interest in feminist agenda, and she was also not very competent. That's why she was also impeached. She was the first president of Korea that was impeached because she did not focus on her political obligation, and there were a lot of allegations of corruptions and stuff. So we are very sad that we had female president, and it was a record-making moment, but we are also very sad that because of her case, now a lot of people think, oh, now we can't trust women anymore, and they are now just generalizing. She was a very specific character, daughter of a dictator, and now all the people are saying, oh, we can't leave it to women anymore, and now all the other women are just being like speechless, and we don't know how to argue with that. But so hopefully we will have better examples and more better examples of women politicians coming up, and there are some young women politicians who are making some changes, and hopefully these representations make some differences, and I hope the bad experience with previous president part disappears within people's minds. Yeah, so
Maybe she was.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Yes, Zainab.
Maybe she was set up to fail.
Okay.
I do think so. Maybe I do think so. Maybe she
So-
was impeached because she was a woman. Who knows? I think people were also harsh on her, but who knows? Yeah.
Yeah, well, what the good thing is you do end on a very positive note by sort of drawing our attention to the rising stars, some new figures and young that are rising up in Korean politics, and so we hope that these issues are taken, that the voices from below finally reach and settle in the spaces where they have to be. I think it's on that note that I want to thank you both for the brilliant presentations and for the engagement with the participants. I thank the participants very much for the questions that were put to the presenters. It's been a rich discussion, and I have learned from this discussion. I think that we would be happy if these papers are actually made available in some way, so that those who want to read more and understand certain aspects that perhaps were not highlighted from the papers would be able to do so. So if there's nothing else to add, I would say have a nice day, rest of day, and hope our paths cross again. Bye.